Paper 3 is entitled Political Ideas. This is all about the ideas and ideologies and to distinguish them from policies. Each section is divided into 4 dominant themes: human nature, the state, society, and economy. Answers to questions must take into account these themes whenever they are relevant. The specification requires you to have knowledge about the beliefs of a number of key thinkers alongside the core themes. The key thinkers will vary depending on the ideology that you are looking at. For example, Betty Friedan is one for liberalism and Bell Hooks is one for feminism. Whilst it is not required to read their political books, you might want to for extra knowledge and understanding of their thoughts. Let's take a look at the 4 themes of Paper 3. First up is human nature. This is a belief about the fundamental nature of mankind's relationship with other people in the world. Various thinkers have described human nature in very varied ways, from egocentric to social, from fundamentally good to fundamentally competitive. Secondly, there is the state. Nearly all people live under the jurisdiction of one state or another. Political ideologies therefore have adopted principles about the nature of the state, what part, if any, it should play in society, and how it should be controlled and whether it is a force for good or evil. Our third core theme is society. All societies have a particular structure which has evolved naturally or been imposed by the state and those who govern the state. Most ideologies therefore have developed some vision of what their ideal society would look like, some specific and some more vague, such as conservatism. And our final core theme is the economy. Not all political ideologies contain a strong economic perspective, but some do and should be reflected in analysis where it applies. Before we can start looking deeply into feminism, let's have a quick introduction to the ideology itself. Feminism is one of the most successful political movements in recent history. This claim is born out of the fact that many commentators refer to the current age as a post-feminist era. This implies that the traditional goals of feminism, which are anti-discrimination, full, equal legal and political rights for women, anti-sexism and equality of opportunity and so forth, have largely been achieved, and therefore are no longer relevant to current discourse on the position of women in society. This does not mean that feminism is an out-of-date philosophy. Instead, it means that new questions need to be posed and answered with regard to women and relations between the sexes. It is merely the traditional debates around feminist issues that need to be replaced with new ones. We can find largely fragmentary evidence of a growing female consciousness and opposition to the male-dominated world. But the first well-known and rigorous work on women's rights was written by the English liberal Mary Wollstonecraft. This was in her book A Vindication of the Rights on Women, published in 1792. Wollstonecraft was not a feminist in the modern sense of the word, but she was a pioneer of the movement. Feminism as a serious political and social movement did not emerge until the middle and second half of the 19th century. For example, in Britain, the great liberal John Stuart Mill and his wife Harriet Taylor campaigned for the passage of the Married Women's Property Act in 1882, which allowed women to keep their own property after they married. In the US too, Charlotte Perkins Gilman was writing extensively about the lack of opportunities for independent women and arguing that the inferior position of women in the home was a model of their subordinate position in wider life. It was not until the 1960s that the movement known today as feminism began to emerge. This second period of advancement for women was known as the second wave feminism. The second wave was part of a broader cultural movement spreading at the time which sought to offer a general critique of post-industrial society, especially identifying the alienation of various social groups from a society of growing mass communication and consumerism. As part of our paper, we must refer to key thinkers. Here are our 5 feminist key thinkers. Firstly, we have Simone de Beauvoir. Then we have Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Bell Hooks, Kate Millett, and lastly Sheila Rowbotham. We will become more familiar with these women as time progresses and know each about their thoughts on feminism and which strand of the ideology they belong to. Simone de Beauvoir is known as the first existential feminist. The existentialist philosophical movement founded by Kierkegaard in the 19th century took hold amongst French intellectuals in the 1950s, most notably Jean-Paul Sartre, who was de Beauvoir's lover, and Albert Camus. Existentialism set the freedom of the individual against the constrictions placed on him or her by the moral and religious world around them, and exhorted them to struggle against restrictions by imposing their own will upon life. Failing to impose one's own will is known as bad faith, but succeeding is known as authenticity. For de Beauvoir, for too long women had lived their lives in bad faith imposed upon them by men. She also developed the idea as women being the other. The idea of otherness was that men have characterized women as different, but different in a way of their being men's choosing, not the choosing of women themselves. Duvivier famously declared that women are made, not born. The problem is that they are made by men. In her best-known work, The Second Sex, she rejects the notion that girls are born with any nurturing instincts. Rather, she asserts that they learn it from their parents and from their schooling. In existential terms, therefore, their freedom to choose their own way of life is removed almost from birth. The roles that women play have been determined for them by men. Even in their personal relations, women are inferior, as she writes, on the day when it will be possible for women to love not in her weakness but in her strength, not to escape herself but to find herself, not to abase herself but to assert herself. On that day love will become for her, as for man, a source of life and not of mortal danger. Her solution to the plight of women was twofold. First, women must be granted the opportunity to make as many choices as men, to be able to escape from the drudgery of housework and their roles in marriage as a kind of sex slave. This will be achieved largely through education, economic freedom, state-funded childcare, legalized abortion, and widespread conception. But Duvivier also asserted that women must liberate themselves. They must seek sexual liberation and freedom from the structures of the nuclear family. She was an influence on all feminists who came after her, but especially on Friedan. Whilst Bouvier used history and philosophy to confirm her theories, Friedan used specific research. However, despite their different methodology, both women came to very similar conclusions. This extract from The Second Sex perfectly sums up the ideas of the early second-wave feminists. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, physiological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female represents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine. Charlotte Perkins Gilman expressed her visions of early feminism in both fictional works and scholarly writings. Writing at a time when Darwinism was highly popular and being adapted to suit several political philosophies, not at least the defence of free market capitalism, Gilman set up an attack on those who suggested that Darwin's theories could be used to justify male domination of society. Darwinist theory, mainly the survival of the fittest, suggested that it was biologically inevitable that men should be the dominant sex because they were more suited to compete in nature, being stronger and not tied down by the need to rear children. This was no longer the case, Gilman argued, largely because the nature of economic activity had changed so much. There were no reasons why women could not play an equal part alongside men in modern economies. So the biological differences between men and women had become irrelevant. She asserted that women had equal brain power to men, and this justified their equality in modern society. The way in which women should be liberated from such male domination lay in the equality of opportunity, and therefore a full place in the world of employment. Gilman was ahead of her time in this respect, as she understood that girls are socialized from an early age, at home and in school, to take on the role of motherhood and homemaking, rather than thinking of a wider role and career in the economic world outside the home. In other words, their confinement to roles in the home is culturally, not biologically determined. This notion of socialization into a male-dominated culture did not reach widespread consciousness until the 1960s. Gilman's perspective on the position of women in the modern economy was expressed succinctly and bluntly when she wrote her book Women in Economics in 1897. The labour of women in the house certainly enables men to produce more wealth than they otherwise could, and in this way women are economic factors in society, but so are horses. However, it is probably in the field of family reform that Gilman is best remembered today. Concerned as she was by her belief that child rearing and housework amounted to domestic slavery, she campaigned for the destruction of the traditional nuclear family and its replacement by forms of communal living, whereby child rearing and housework would be shared both amongst men and between men and women, thus freeing women for a wider role in society. Bell Hooks was born Gloria Watkins. She adopted the name of her great-grandmother Bell Hooks, whom she admired hugely. She does not use uppercase letters for her pen name so that she will not be confused with her great-grandmother. Hooks is a radical black American feminist and is perhaps best known for her work in intersectionality. In her analysis of the inferior position of women, she brings the starting point that society is completely disfigured by inequality in general. This inequality is represented by different groups in society, not just the poor, but also ethnic minorities such as gays and religious minorities. It follows from this that seeking to create equality for women is no solution. Rather, equality must be fully established in society as a universal principle. In that way, women too will become equal. Hooks criticizes many feminists for not recognizing this reality. They have concentrated too much on women, especially white middle-class women. Using her perspective as a black woman, she asserts that women like her will achieve equality only if black people as a whole achieve equality. Furthermore, she and all black women face problems that white women do not. The same is true of gay women, the poor, and other minority groups. This is the essence of intersectionality. This confluence of multiple forms of discrimination and oppression makes feminist aims more complex than the movement had appreciated. It also means that men have a valid role to play because they can enter the struggle against inequality between all groups. Perhaps the most radical of Hooks's ideas, however, is that the patriarchy has taught women to hate themselves and to see themselves as inferior. In her influential work, Feminism is for Everyone, written in 2000, she writes, "We all knew firsthand that we had been socialized as females by patriarchal approval, to look upon each other jealously, fear and hatred. Sexist thinking made us judge each other without compassion and punish one another harshly. Feminist thinking helped us unlearn female self-hatred. It enabled us to break free of the hold patriarchal thinking had on our consciousness." For Hooks, the struggle against patriarchy should have two elements. The first is the creation of a more equal society, so that multiple disadvantages that women face can be reduced and then eliminated. The second concerns the direct relationships between men and women. Men must come to understand the patriarchy that they are imposing, while women must break free of the preconceptions about themselves, which are the product of men's domination of sexual culture. In her more romantic passages, Hooks speaks of the power of love to conquer the current unhealthy relationships, but above all she argues that women need to unlearn self-hatred and no longer see ourselves and our bodies as the property of men. In the history of feminism, Bell Hooks belongs mainly in the contemporary branch of the movement, known as postmodern feminism, as she is attempting to break the movement free of its traditional perspectives and to accept modern realities. American Kate Millett was perhaps the most influential of all the radical feminists. Her best-known book, Sexual Politics, published in 1969 at the height of the new interest in feminism, was both controversial and provocative, but it sparked off a new direction in the movement. At first, she was active in the National Organization for Women, but she quickly moved towards a more radical form of politics. Millett's perception of patriarchy was a dual one. She saw the dominance of men in terms of both sexism, an entrenched belief in male superiority, and heterosexualism, the idea that the heterosexual relationships are superior to the gay relationship. She herself was a bisexual, which placed her in a good position to be able to view sexism in a more complete way. Her main contention in sexual politics was that it is necessary for women to find sexual liberation first if they are to achieve liberation in general life. All heterosexual relationships are effectively political in a patriarchal society because they involve men exercising power over women. It follows from this that women who are able to accept their lesbianism or are able to convert to that form of sexuality place themselves on the road to personal liberation. Needless to say, these were highly controversial views, which attracted a huge following, but also a cascade of criticism. It would be wrong, however, to characterize Millett as nothing more than a lesbian feminist. She also analysed women's place in society and in the economy. For her, as for many radical thinkers of the time, the word politics had acquired a new, broader connotation. This was the idea that wherever one group oppresses another, the result is political in nature, and the solution must be the liberation of the oppressed group, hence the wider term liberation politics. So it is with men oppressing women, Millett argues. The patriarchy is therefore intensely political in nature. Millett is not normally classed as a socialist feminist, but some of her ideas chimed with socialist ideas. In particular, she described the plight of the working class woman thus: "The toil of working class women is more readily accepted as need, if not always by the working class itself, at least by the middle class. And to be sure, it serves the purpose of making cheap labour in factories and low-grade service in clerical positions. Its wages and tasks are so unremunerative that, unlike more prestigious employment for women, it fails to threaten the patriarchy financially or psychologically. It is also implied in the above connotations that Millett criticised parts of the feminist movement for being concerned largely with the problems relating to the middle-class feminism. Sheila Rowbottom is a leading English socialist feminist who gained a towering reputation among academics, if less so among feminist activists. She came from a Marxist background, but also criticised Marxists for taking a narrow view of the oppression of women by confining themselves to analysing the role of women in industrial capitalism rather than in domestic life and wider society. Her most influential work was probably Women's Consciousness, Men's World, published in 1973. She wrote one of the best-known statements in feminist literature when she said famously, "Men will often admit other women are oppressed, but not you." This implies that men cannot really understand the nature of the oppression that they are imposing upon women. In other words, they can recognise it in theory, but not in practice. For Rowbottom, the best hope for liberation of women lies in a socialist future. Under capitalism, there is little hope that women will ever be able to escape from the patriarchal society. She points out that the greatest advances for women have taken place after socialist revolutions. While the neoliberal revolution in capitalist society in the 1980s appeared to offer widening opportunities for women, it did not offer ultimate liberation, and little progress was actually made. Women remain a cheap source of labour and are still denied the same opportunities as men. Only in a society where complete equality is imposed will women achieve equal status with men. This, for Rowbottom, means socialism. Paradoxically, Rowbottom is both a Marxist and a critic of Marxism. The inferior oppressed position of women is seen by Marxists as economically determined, with which she agrees, but she adds that this is too narrow a view. Women are opposed in the home life and in wider culture too. This means that a socialist revolution will not automatically liberate women, they must be freed from oppression in the home life, in personal relationships and in the wider culture. Firestone and Hannich's assertion that the person is political is echoed in Rowbottom's feminism. Because she sees the roots of oppression as lying in personal relationships between men and women, it is as such the task of men, as women, to end the patriarchy. Women cannot do it on their own, she believes. Men also must become willing to relinquish their dominant position by seeing the patriarchy for what it really is. By looking at the key thinkers, you will have noticed similarities and differences between them, as not all feminist thinkers approach the political ideology in the same way. Within feminism, there are different strands. For example, there are liberal feminists, radical feminists, and social feminists. Liberal feminism is a prominent branch of feminism that aims to advocate for women's legal and political rights. Radical feminism seeks to dismantle the traditional patriarchal power and gender roles that keep women oppressed. Socialist feminism is a two-pronged theory that broadens Marxist feminism's argument for the role of capitalism in the oppression of women and radical feminism's theory of the role of gender and the patriarchy. Socialist feminists reject radical feminism's main claim that the patriarchy is the only or primary source of oppression of women. Throughout this module, we must be aware of which strand our key thinkers belong to. Simone de Beauvoir is a liberal feminist, along with Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who is also seen as more liberal. Bell Hooks and Kate Millett are radical feminists, and Sheila Rowbottom is our only socialist feminist that we will look at during this course.